Snow swept across the prairie in heavy sheets, piling against the sagging walls of the barn. The roof groaned under the weight, and the air inside smelled of hay and frost. Margaret Hale clutched her shawl tighter as she pushed the door open, a lantern trembling in her hand. The faint light flickered over the matted straw, and that was when she saw him, collapsed in the shadows, his beard crusted with ice, his coat torn and blood dark at the side. His breath came shallow, broken like a man halfway to the grave. For a long moment she stood frozen. Widowhood had hardened her into someone who no longer trusted chance or strangers. Since her husband's death, the town had found ways to turn its back on her, whispering behind hands at the mercantile, telling her she should remarry or move on, treating her as though her grief was a stain. She had survived on scraps of kindness and her own weary hands, keeping her children clothed and fed by sheer will. And now here in the bitter cold, lay a stranger in her barn, bleeding into the hay. Her first instinct was to drag him out. A widow could not afford scandal, not in a place where every pair of eyes waited for her to stumble. James, her 12-year-old, stood at the doorway, jaw set tight. "Ma," he warned, his voice already carrying the caution of a man. "We don't know who he is. He could be dangerous." Annie, just 8, pressed against her mother's skirts, her small hand reaching toward the stranger with fearless tenderness. "He's cold," she whispered. Margaret's heart twisted. Children saw truth without the varnish of fear, and Annie's truth was that this man was dying. She could almost hear the voices of her neighbors, the widows taken in a man and not even married to him. She bit her lip until it stung. Reputation had cost her too much already. Yet when she knelt beside the mountain man, when her fingers brushed his frozen skin, she felt something like a tether pulling at her, an obligation she could not shrug off. Against her own fear, she began the work of mercy. Inside the house, with the fire low and her hands shaking, she cleaned his wound. The bullet had torn deep, the flesh angry and swollen. She boiled snowmelt for water, stitched as best she could with trembling fingers, whispering prayers she hadn't dared speak in years. Annie hummed beside her, the melody of a lullaby long absent from the home. When the man stirred, his eyes flickered open only for a heartbeat, pale and clouded, before shutting again. Margaret laid her late husband's coat over his chest, whispering to herself that she was a fool, though her hand lingered a moment longer than it should have. The next morning, when Margaret ventured into town for flour, she felt the weight of eyes on her. At the counter of the mercantile, 2 women leaned close, their voices a hiss. "Smoke rising from her chimney all night, did you see? Maybe she's keeping company already." Margaret pretended not to hear, but shame curled hot in her chest. She hurried home, heart pounding. The man in her barn was a danger not just to her safety but to her dignity, what little of it remained. Yet that night, as snow whispered against the roof, she heard a low rasping voice. She entered the barn and found him half awake, his words rough but clear. "Thank you." His gaze, though clouded with pain, held something raw and unguarded. Margaret's breath caught, and she retreated before she could answer. Days passed, each marked by the sound of wind tearing across the plains. Slowly the man began to regain strength. His name was Colton Briggs, though he spoke it only once, as if unused to the sound. He was not a man of words. When James struggled with the axe, Colton rose from the hay, limping, pale as death, and guided the boy's hands in silence. Margaret watched from the doorway, the rhythm of steel against wood steady and strong. Something stirred in her chest, unwelcome yet undeniable, the memory of what it felt like not to carry every burden alone. One night, she woke to the sound of a cry. Rushing to the barn, she found Colton thrashing, breath ragged with dreams that had turned to torment. She touched his shoulder, and his eyes flew open, wild and haunted. For a long silence he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he told her he had been hunted, that his presence in her barn was no chance. Margaret felt her stomach twist. His arrival was no accident, it carried a weight she did not yet understand. She returned to the doorway, lantern in hand, and looked out at the endless snow falling across the prairie. Her heart warred within her. Fear told her to send him away, but compassion, stubborn, reckless compassion, kept her rooted. Somewhere in the quiet storm, she knew the path ahead had already been altered by this man's presence, whether she welcomed it or not. The winter deepened, swallowing the land in silence. Days blurred into one another, each marked by the hiss of wind under the eaves and the long shadows of the barn stretching across snow. Margaret told herself that Colton would leave once his strength returned, but when he tried to rise on his own, his legs buckled and blood seeped through the bandages she had sewn. He fell against the doorframe and she caught him before he struck the ground. His weight was heavy, unyielding, and for a moment she felt the raw truth. He was hers to keep alive whether she wished it or not. Colton muttered that he should go, that trouble was bound to follow him. But Margaret shook her head. "You won't last a mile in this weather." Her voice was sharper than she meant, brittle with fear. He met her eyes, and though he said no more, a kind of surrender passed between them. That night by the fire he told fragments of his story. He had once ridden with men who called themselves brothers, but their bond was nothing more than cruelty dressed in loyalty. When he broke away they branded him a traitor. The bullet in his side had come from one of them. Margaret listened, her hands folded in her lap. She was not sure if he spoke truth or half-truths, but when Annie drifted asleep against his shoulder, his arm curved around her protectively, and Margaret felt a tremor in her chest. That small gesture said more than his words ever could. The outside world, however, was not blind. Rumors thickened in town. Men lingered longer at the mercantile, asking questions about a stranger seen limping near her place. Margaret's ears burned as she walked past their stairs, carrying home only half the supplies she needed, her dignity thinning under the weight of gossip. She feared for her children, for the fragile home she had pieced together, but the fear sharpened into steel the night distant hoofbeats broke the stillness. Colton knew before she did. He rose from his bed of hay and stood at the barn's window, face hard in the moonlight. "They found me." His voice carried no surprise, only the weariness of a man long chased. Margaret's pulse thundered. Every instinct begged her to send him out, to bar the doors, to shield her children at any cost. Yet he turned to her, and for the first time she saw not only scars and shadows but a man resolved. "I've run all my life," he said softly. "Not this time." James, who had once eyed him with suspicion, now begged him to stay. "We can fight," the boy whispered fiercely. Colton crouched to meet his gaze, laying a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Fighting is not glory, son. It's surviving." He showed James how to bank the fire, how to listen for the wind's change, how to set a snare in the snow. Margaret watched her son's shoulders straighten, a smile flickering where grief had long lived. The storm came with the riders. 3 men, their shapes blurred in the blizzard, closed in on the barn with voices rough as gravel. "Come out, Briggs. You don't belong to yourself no more." Margaret stood in the doorway, lantern clutched in trembling hands. She felt her knees weaken, but she did not move. Behind her, James hovered, pale but unyielding. Colton stepped forward into the snow, the wind whipping his coat. He looked at Margaret once, a glance both apology and promise, then faced the men who had once called him brother. Silence thickened, broken only by the creak of saddles and the whine of wind. When the first man reached for his gun, the world seemed to split. Snow churned as the fight erupted. Steel flashed, lantern light flared against the storm. Colton moved with the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose, each strike carrying the weight of survival. One rider fell, clutching his leg. Another lunged, only to be met with Colton's strength and the crack of bone. Margaret, heart hammering, lifted the lantern high, then in a sudden surge of courage, hurled it at the third man. Glass shattered, fire spilled against the snow, hissing and bright. The attackers broke, scattered by flame and fury, their curses carried away by the wind. When it ended, Colton staggered, blood painting fresh stains on the snow. Margaret rushed to him, catching him as he fell, his breath hot against her cheek. His eyes searched hers, weary but open, and she whispered, "You don't have to run anymore." He closed his eyes, not in defeat but in trust, leaning into her as though the storm itself had finally loosened its hold. For the first time in years, the Hale homestead felt like more than survival. James stood tall, Annie clung to Margaret's skirts, and Colton, though broken, was no longer alone. Snow still fell, endless and quiet, but inside the barn there was warmth that even winter could not steal. And so it was that an accident became destiny. A dying man stumbled into their lives, and in saving him they saved themselves. We are not measured by the storms that batter our doors, but by the mercy we dare to give a stranger. Remember this: love does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes limping through the snow, a burden at first glance, a blessing once you have the courage to see it for what it truly is.